The dust rose first, a pale ghost against the hard blue canvas of the sky. It was the only warning. Owen watched it from the fence line he was mending, his hands, calloused and sure, stilling on the wire. He was a man who understood the language of the land, and this was the grammar of intrusion. 3 riders, moving with an arrogance that churned the dry earth into a statement. He straightened his back, the sun hot on his neck, and his eyes, the color of worn slate, narrowed. He knew the silhouette of the lead rider, Griffin, a man who dealt in debts and flesh, whose laughter always sounded like breaking glass. Owen had no business with him, had made sure of it for years, but Griffin's presence on his land was a debt being called in, whether it was owed or not. He dropped his tools, the metallic clatter unnaturally loud in the vast quiet, and walked with a steady, unhurried pace toward the small cabin that was the heart of his solitary world. He reached the porch as they reined in, their horses sweating and agitated. Griffin swung down from his saddle, a wide, predatory grin stretching beneath his mustache. His 2 men remained mounted, their hands resting near their holsters, their gazes sweeping the property with practiced menace. Griffin didn't waste time on greetings. He jerked his head toward the wagon they'd been pulling. One of his men dismounted, went to the back, and dragged out a figure. It was a woman, small and slight, in a pale pink dress that was smudged with dirt and grime. Her hands were bound in front of her. She stumbled but caught herself, her chin lifting with a pride that seemed to defy the rope at her wrists. She was young, Chinese, her face a mask of composed fear and defiance. Her black hair was pulled back tightly, but loose strands whipped around her face in the hot breeze. She did not cry, she did not plead. She simply stood, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, refusing to acknowledge her captors or her new surroundings. "Settling a marker," Griffin announced, his voice oily with satisfaction. He gestured to the woman. "The railroad baron who owed me went bust. This was all he had left of value. A mail-order bride, fresh off the boat. Heard you were in the market for some company out here." Owen's face remained impassive, but a cold knot tightened in his stomach. He said nothing. His silence was a wall, solid and unbreachable. Griffin's grin widened. He clearly mistook the silence for acceptance, or perhaps stupidity. "She's yours now. Payment in full." He strode over to the woman, untied her ropes with a rough tug, and shoved her forward. She stumbled again, catching herself on the bottom step of the porch. Her eyes, dark and deep, finally met Owen's. In them he saw not a plea for help, but an assessment. She was measuring him. Griffin chuckled, mounting his horse. "Don't say I never did you any favors." He tipped his hat in a mocking gesture, and with a sharp command to his men, wheeled his horse around. They rode off the way they came, leaving a cloud of dust and a profound, unwelcome silence in their wake. The woman, May, remained at the foot of the steps, a piece of living flotsam washed up on the shores of his quiet life. Owen stood on the porch for a long time after they were gone, the rifle he'd picked up on his way from the fence line held loosely in his hand. He wasn't looking at the woman. He was looking at the horizon, at the empty space where the dust cloud had been, as if he could will them to return and take back the disruption they had left behind. But the land remained empty, and the silence was now hers as much as his. She had not moved. Her posture was rigid, a soldier at attention, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. The light pink of her dress was a jarring splash of color against the muted browns and grays of his world. He could feel her watching him, her gaze a physical weight. He knew what Griffin and men like him thought of him. A quiet, simple man, content with his own company, easily overlooked, easily imposed upon. They saw his solitude as weakness. They did not understand that his solitude was a fortress he had built, brick by brick, a defense against a world he had long ago decided was better kept at a distance. And now its walls had been breached. A past failure echoed in the back of his mind, a quiet but persistent ghost. A time he had stood by, had chosen the path of non-interference, and had lived with the bitter taste of that inaction for years. He would not make that mistake again. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and leaned the rifle against the cabin wall, just inside the door. The action was measured, meant to be seen. It was not a threat, but it was not a welcome either. It was a statement of fact. There was a weapon, and he knew how to use it. Then he walked past her, giving her a wide berth, and went back to the fence line he had been mending. He picked up his tools. The sun beat down on his back. He wrapped the wire, stretched it, hammered the staples into the post. His movements were fluid, economical, the familiar rhythm a comfort. He did not look back at the house, but he was aware of her in every nerve ending. He could feel her presence like a change in barometric pressure. He worked until his shadow grew long, until the heat of the day began to bleed out into a cooler twilight. He was asserting the order of his world, showing her and himself that this intrusion would not shatter the routines that held his life together. It was a silent, stubborn battle of wills, waged across a dusty yard under the vast, indifferent sky. She would not beg, and he would not command. As the last sliver of the sun dipped below the western ridges, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Owen finally laid down his tools. The fence was repaired, the horses were fed and watered, the chickens were secure in their coop. The rhythm of his day was complete, a circle closed against the chaos that had arrived on his doorstep. He walked to the well, the worn wood of the handle smooth beneath his palm, and drew a bucket of cool, clear water. The splash and creak were the only sounds in the deepening dusk. He poured a dipperful and drank deeply, the water a balm to his dry throat. Then he refilled it. He walked toward the porch. May hadn't moved from her spot, though she now sat on the top step, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. She looked small and exhausted, but her dignity was a cloak she wore as surely as the pink dress. He stopped at the bottom step, a careful 5 feet away from her. He placed the dipper of water on the weathered wood. Next to it, he set down a tin plate on which he'd put a thick slice of day-old bread and a few pieces of salted pork he'd taken from the larder. It was plain, simple food. It was what he had. He did this without looking at her directly, his focus on the objects, on the act of giving. He did not want her to see pity in his eyes. Pity was an insult. He was offering sustenance, nothing more. A transaction between two strangers bound by circumstances neither had chosen. He straightened up and without a word turned and walked toward the barn. He didn't go inside completely. He stood just within the great open doorway, letting the deep shadows conceal him. From there, he watched the house. For a long time she did not move. The plate and the dipper sat on the step, a silent offering between them. A night bird called from the cottonwoods down by the creek. The first stars began to prick the velvet blackness of the sky. He thought for a moment that she would refuse it, that her pride was a wall too high for even basic human need to scale. Then he saw her stir. Her movements were slow, almost reluctant, as if every inch was a concession. She reached for the dipper, her small hand steady. She drank the water in long, slow swallows, her throat working. He could almost feel the relief of it himself. When she was done, she set the dipper down with a soft click. She looked at the plate. She tore off a small piece of the bread and ate it methodically, chewing each bite thoroughly before swallowing. She did not touch the pork. It was enough. It was a start. She had accepted. He retreated deeper into the barn's darkness, the scent of hay and horse a familiar comfort. He felt a strange, unfamiliar loosening in his chest. It wasn't relief, not exactly. It was the quiet acknowledgement that a line had been crossed. The standoff was over. A new, uncertain chapter had begun. The days that followed fell into a strange and silent rhythm. Owen rose with the sun, as he always had, and went about the ceaseless work of the ranch. He moved with a quiet purpose that bordered on ritual, his actions a testament to a life stripped down to its essentials. He mucked out the stalls, repaired a loose shingle on the barn roof, cleared stones from the small patch of land he hoped to one day cultivate, and through it all he was acutely aware of May. She remained a fixture on the porch, a silent observer of his life. She was his shadow, a constant presence at the edge of his vision. Each morning he would leave a plate of food and a dipper of fresh water on the porch step. Each evening he would find the plate empty, wiped clean, and set neatly to the side. He learned she did not like pork, but would eat the salted beef. He learned she preferred the cornbread to the hardtack. These were discoveries made in silence, observations that formed the basis of a strange, unspoken communication. He never tried to get closer. He never tried to speak. The gulf of language was one barrier, but the deeper one was the chasm of circumstance. He was her keeper, whether he wanted to be or not, and any attempt at familiarity felt like a trespass. One evening, as a chill wind swept down from the mountains, he took a thick wool blanket from his chest and left it folded on the porch sling. The next morning he saw her wrapped in it, watching the sunrise. She did not acknowledge the gift with a look or a gesture, but her use of it was thanks enough. He began to see the person beneath the stoic facade. He saw the meticulous way she rebraided her hair each morning, her fingers weaving the dark strands into a perfect shining rope. He saw how she cared for her single dress, brushing off the dust and smoothing the wrinkles as best she could. He saw her stand and stretch, her movements graceful and fluid, a dancer trapped on a dusty stage. He saw not the frightened girl Griffin had thrown at his feet, but a woman of immense and quiet fortitude, a survivor, holding the shattered pieces of her life together with sheer will. The anger he had felt at Griffin for the intrusion on his land began to shift, to transform. It was no longer just about the violation of his solitude. It was about her. The weight of that responsibility settled on him like the dust on the plains. And if you appreciate stories about the quiet choices that define a person, consider supporting this channel. It allows us to keep telling tales like Owen's. Now, back to the ranch. He knew this fragile peace couldn't last. Griffin was a man who enjoyed admiring his possessions. He would be back. The thought was a cold stone in his gut. His responsibility was no longer just to feed and shelter her. It was to protect her. And he found, to his own surprise, that it was a responsibility he was willing to bear. A week into their silent cohabitation, the sky turned. The brilliant, relentless blue of the summer sky began to curdle, darkening at the edges to a bruised, angry purple. The air grew heavy and thick, charged with an energy that made the hair on Owen's arms stand on end. A storm was coming, a real gully washer. He'd been in the far pasture, checking on a newborn calf, and had to race the churning clouds back to the homestead. The wind picked up, a low moan that grew into a physical force, kicking up dirt and stinging his eyes. It whipped the branches of the lone cottonwood by the creek into a frenzy. He stabled his horse, the animal skittish and wild-eyed, then moved to secure the barn, checking the latches on the great doors and the smaller windows. The first fat drops of rain, heavy as coins, began to spatter in the dust. He glanced toward the house and saw her. May was still on the porch, but she was standing now, facing the oncoming storm. Her pink dress was plastered to her small frame by the wind, her long black hair torn from its braid and lashing around her face. She stood perfectly still, a lone, defiant figure against the violent onslaught of nature. She wasn't trying to seek shelter. She was meeting the storm head-on, as if it were a foe she could face down with the same stoic resolve she had shown him. Something inside Owen snapped. It was a raw, primal instinct, a protective urge that bypassed thought and went straight to action. His caution, the careful distance he had maintained for days, evaporated in the face of the tempest. He left the relative safety of the barn and strode out into the wind in the now driving rain. The short distance to the porch felt like miles. The wind tore at him, trying to push him back. He reached the steps and mounted them in 2 strides. He stood before her, his large frame shielding her from the worst of the gale. He didn't speak. Words would be useless, swallowed by the wind's roar. Instead, he simply looked at her, then turned his head and gestured with a slight, deliberate nod toward the open door of the cabin behind them. It was an invitation, a clear and simple offer of shelter. Her dark eyes, glistening with rain, locked onto his. He could see the storm reflected in them, but beneath it he saw a flicker of uncertainty, of fear, of a deep and profound weariness. She searched his face, looking for the trap, the hidden motive, the price of his offer. He held her gaze, keeping his own expression neutral, patient. He did not move, did not pressure her. The choice had to be hers. For a long, stretched-out moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then she gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. She turned, and with a grace that defied the chaos around them, she stepped across the threshold into his home. The door closed with a solid thud, shutting out the roar of the storm. Inside, the world shrank to the dimensions of the single room, and the silence rushed in to fill the space. It was a different kind of silence than the one they had shared outdoors. It was closer, more intimate, charged with the awareness of their shared proximity. Rain hammered against the roof and sluiced down the single glass window pane, distorting the violent world outside into a watery blur. Owen moved past her, his boots leaving damp prints on the clean-swept wooden floor. He went to the hearth, where embers still glowed from his morning fire. He added a few pieces of kindling and a small log, coaxing the flames back to life. A warm yellow light began to push back against the gloomy twilight filtering through the window. He lit a kerosene lantern on the table, its steady glow adding to the room's warmth. He did all this with his back to her, conscious of giving her space, of not crowding her. He knew she was still standing just inside the door, her back pressed against the wood, a cornered animal ready to bolt. He could feel her gaze on him, taking in every detail of his home. It was a sparse space, utilitarian and orderly. A simple bed in one corner, a sturdy table and 2 chairs in the center. A shelf on the wall held a few tin plates, a handful of books, their spines worn from use. The floor was swept, the blankets on the bed were folded, and the firewood was neatly stacked. It was the home of a man who lived a deliberate life, a life of structure and self-reliance. It was not the den of a monster. He moved to the stove and began to prepare a meal. The simple domestic sounds, the clatter of a pot, the slice of a knife through vegetables, the sizzle of bacon in a hot pan, filled the cabin. He was making a simple stew, something warm and filling to ward off the chill of the storm. He worked methodically, his hands sure and practiced. He was communicating in the only way he knew how, through action. He was showing her that this space was one of nurture, not of threat. When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 bowls. He placed one on the table for himself. He took the other and walked over to the hearth. He set it on the floor next to a low stool, a clear invitation. He didn't look at her as he did it. He simply went to the table and sat down, beginning to eat. After a moment, he heard a soft rustle of movement. He didn't look up, but in his peripheral vision, he saw her cross the room, her steps light and cautious. She picked up the bowl and sat on the stool by the fire, cradling its warmth in her hands. They ate in silence, the storm their only orchestra. The crackle of the fire, the drumming of the rain, the soft scrape of spoon against bowl. It was the first meal they had shared, the first time they had broken bread under the same roof. It was a truce, a fragile peace declared in the heart of a storm. The morning after the storm broke clear and sharp, the air scrubbed clean and smelling of wet earth and sage. The sunlight that streamed through the cabin window seemed brighter, as if the world had been given a new coat of paint. Owen rose early, as was his habit, moving quietly so as not to disturb her. She had slept on a pallet of blankets he'd made for her by the hearth, a respectable distance from his own bed. He'd expected her to leave the cabin at first light, to retreat back to the porch in the careful distance she had maintained. But when he stepped outside into the cool, damp air, he saw her already there. She was folding the wool blanket from the porch swing, the one she had used during the storm. Her movements were precise, economical, each fold perfect and crisp. She placed the neatly folded blanket on the porch railing. Then she picked up the worn broom that leaned against the wall. With steady, methodical strokes, she began to sweep the porch, clearing away the leaves and debris the storm had left behind. Owen stopped by the barn door, watching her. This was not the act of a servant paying for her keep. He understood that instinctively. This was an act of ownership, of contribution. She was not cleaning his porch. She was tending to a space that was now, in some small way, hers as well. She was imposing her own sense of order onto the chaos of her life. It was a quiet declaration of self-worth. He went about his morning chores, his mind on the small figure on the porch. The dynamic between them had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. She was no longer just a presence he had to accommodate. She was a part of the fabric of his home. When he came back to the cabin for his breakfast, he found a plate and a cup set for him at the table. A silent gesture of reciprocation, an acknowledgement of the meal he had provided the night before. He looked over at her. She was standing by the stove, her hands clasped behind her back. She met his gaze, and for the first time her expression was not one of defiance or fear, but of simple, direct acknowledgement. He gave a short, single nod of thanks. She responded with an equally slight, almost imperceptible dip of her chin. A language was being built between them, word by word, gesture by gesture. It was a language of mutual respect, forged in shared silence and quiet action. Later that day, he found her by the small creek that ran behind the cabin, carefully washing her pink dress in the clear, cold water. He left a bar of lye soap on a flat rock nearby and a length of rope he'd strung between 2 trees for her to use as a clothesline. He didn't say a word. When he passed by again an hour later, the soap was half used and the dress was hanging from the line, fluttering in the breeze. He felt a quiet satisfaction. He was learning her needs, and she was beginning to trust that he would meet them without demanding anything in return. He was no longer just her protector by circumstance. He was becoming her partner in this strange new life. The peace lasted for 8 days. 8 days of shared silence, of building a fragile routine that felt almost normal. 8 days in which the space between them slowly shrank, filled not with words, but with a growing, unspoken understanding. Then, on the 9th day, Owen saw it again. The pale, telltale plume of dust on the far horizon. It was thinner this time, only 2 riders, but he knew with a cold, sinking certainty who it was. Griffin. The name was a foul taste in his mouth. A feeling of grim inevitability settled over him, heavy as a shroud. He had known this day would come. Men like Griffin did not simply give away something they considered valuable. They came back to gloat, to assert their ownership, to admire their property. He turned from the field he was plowing and walked back toward the cabin, his stride long and purposeful. The sun was hot on his back, but he felt a chill deep in his bones. This was the reckoning. The quiet life he had built and the newer, more complicated life that had just begun were about to be tested. He entered the cabin without a word. May was at the table, a needle and thread in her hand. He had left an old shirt of his out, one with a torn sleeve, and she was mending it with small, perfect stitches. She looked up as he entered, her hands stilling. She saw the look on his face, the hard set of his jaw, the cold light in his eyes, and she knew. She followed his gaze out the window to the approaching dust cloud. All the color drained from her face, leaving it a stark, pale white. But her chin lifted. The fear in her eyes was quickly masked by that familiar, stubborn wall of defiance. She placed the shirt and needle carefully on the table and stood up. Owen moved to the wall where his rifle rested on 2 wooden pegs. He took it down. The weight of it was familiar, comforting. He worked the lever, checking the action. The metallic snick, snick was loud in the quiet room. It was a sound of finality. He didn't look at her, his attention focused on the weapon in his hands. But he spoke to her for the first time in days, his voice a low, steady rumble. "Stay inside." He paused, sliding a cartridge into the chamber. "Lock the door." It was not a request. It was a command. The first he had ever given her. It was an order born not of ownership, but of protection. He saw her nod from the corner of his eye. He turned and walked out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. He heard the heavy wooden bar slide into place. He was alone now, waiting. He stood at the top of the steps, the rifle held loosely at his side, and watched them come. Griffin reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, his companion, a wiry man with shifty eyes, stopping beside him. Griffin's lips were curled into a familiar, arrogant smirk. He swung down from his saddle, his movements exaggerated and theatrical, designed to project an aura of casual power. He sauntered toward the cabin, his spurs jingling with each step. He stopped at the foot of the stairs, looking Owen up and down with open contempt. "Come to check on my investment," Griffin said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. His gaze flickered past Owen toward the closed cabin door. "Hope you've been taking good care of her. Broke her in yet?" The words were a physical blow, crude and possessive. Owen's face remained a mask of stone, but a cold fire ignited in his chest. He did not raise his voice. He did not betray the rage that was coiling in his gut. He simply met Griffin's mocking gaze. "She's not your investment," he said, his voice flat and even, "and she's not a horse to be broken." Griffin let out a short, harsh laugh. "She is what I say she is. I bought her, paid good money. That makes her mine. And since I was so generous as to give her to you, that makes you indebted to me." He hooked his thumbs in his belt, puffing out his chest. "I've come to collect. A favor for a favor." Owen's grip tightened on the stock of his rifle. "I owe you nothing." "Oh, I think you do," Griffin purred, his eyes glinting. He gestured to his man. "Go on in and get her. We're taking her into town. The boys at the saloon will pay a premium for a piece like that." The wiry man started to dismount, a greasy smile spreading across his face. That was the moment. The line had been crossed. With a movement so fluid it seemed almost slow, Owen brought the rifle up, the barrel leveling on Griffin's chest. The quiet click of the hammer being cocked was like a thunderclap in the tense silence. "You're not touching her," Owen said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of an oath. "She is under my protection." Griffin's smirk faltered. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, quickly replaced by a surge of indignant rage. He could not comprehend it. This quiet, solitary farmer, this man he had written off as a nobody, was defying him. For her. "For her?" he spat, his voice thick with incredulity. "You'd stand against me? For a piece of property?" Owen's eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. His voice, when he spoke, was the sound of a door slamming shut, final and absolute. "She's not property, and this is my land." He took a small step forward, the rifle never wavering. "Get off it." The standoff was absolute, a silent, deadly tableau under the hot sun. Griffin's blustering arrogance against Owen's unshakable, quiet resolve. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The world seemed to hang suspended on the point of Owen's rifle. Griffin stared, his face a mask of fury and wounded pride. His entire world view was built on the premise that men like Owen were weak, that they could be pushed, that they would yield to a stronger will. To be defied so completely, so calmly, was an insult he could not absorb. His arrogance, his greatest strength, became his fatal weakness. He could not back down without losing face. "You're a dead man," he snarled, and his hand dropped toward the pistol at his hip. He was fast, but Owen was not reacting to the threat. He had been anticipating it. He was not aiming to kill. Murder was not his way. His goal was simpler: to end the confrontation, to remove the threat. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The shot was deafening. It didn't strike Griffin. It hit the ground an inch from his right boot, kicking up a violent spray of dirt and gravel that stung his face and made him cry out in shock and pain. Before Griffin or his man could process what had happened, Owen worked the lever, ejecting the spent casing and chambering a new round. The wiry gunman, who had frozen halfway off his horse, finally made his own move, fumbling for his weapon. Owen's second shot was just as precise. It tore through the man's gun hand, sending his pistol spinning into the dust and earning a high-pitched scream of agony. The man clutched his bleeding hand, his face contorted in pain. The fight was over before it had truly begun. It had been an exercise in brutal efficiency. No wasted movement, no hesitation. Just 2 shots, 2 decisions, executed with absolute finality. Griffin stood frozen, his hand still hovering over the grip of his pistol. The fight had drained out of him, replaced by a stark, primal fear. He looked at Owen's face, at the cold, unwavering eyes, and he finally understood. This was not a man he could bully. This was not a man who would break. Defeated, humiliated, and suddenly very aware of his own mortality, Griffin slowly, carefully raised his hands. He backed away, his eyes never leaving the rifle pointed at his chest. He fumbled with his horse's reins, mounted with clumsy haste, and, without a backward glance at his wounded companion, dug his heels into the animal's flanks and fled. The injured man, whimpering, scrambled onto his own horse and followed, leaving a trail of blood drops in the dust. Owen stood alone in the yard, the rifle smoke curling lazily from the barrel and dissipating into the hot, still air. He remained motionless until the sound of hoofbeats faded into nothing. The threat was gone. He slowly lowered the rifle, the tension draining out of him, leaving a profound weariness in its place. The cabin door creaked open behind him. May stepped out onto the porch. She looked at him, her dark eyes wide. She looked at the blood in the dust, at the retreating shapes on the horizon, and then her gaze returned to him. Her face was a canvas of complex emotions, shock, fear, and something else, something new, a light he had never seen before. She took a hesitant step toward him. For the first time since she had arrived, she spoke, her voice quiet but clear, the English words carefully formed, as if she had been practicing them, saving them for a moment that mattered. "Thank you." Owen didn't answer. He simply gave a short, sharp nod, acknowledging her words. The debt was paid. Not the false one Griffin had tried to claim, but the one he owed to his own past, to the man he was determined to be. The silence that settled over the ranch now was different. It was not the empty silence of solitude, or the tense silence of uncertainty. It was a shared silence, comfortable and deep. It was the silence of a home defended, of a future earned. They stood together on the porch, watching the dust settle on the horizon. Two solitary souls who had found in each other an unspoken promise in the vast, quiet heart of the land.